This is a very simple demonstration of a Bonita workflow for exercise 1.6 in the fundamentals book. So as I said, this is going to be a simple solution, quick and easy. I'm starting from a fresh Bonita here, and the first thing that we'll do is worry about the business data model. So let's define that. This defines the information that we need in our process. Our process deals with prescriptions and filling prescriptions. So we have a prescription object here. Now we'll keep it simple, as I said. So a prescription object might have a patient name on it. We need to know who the prescription is for. Might have the name of the doctor on it. Might have the date that it was issued on it. We'll make this a date only. It will definitely have the drug name on it. It might have the drug dosage on it. It might have the number of refills on it. Let's make this a number. Later on in the case, it tells us that we need to worry about insurance coverage. So we'll put insurance company on it. And we will need to worry about how much the insurance co-pays. So we will say coverage percentage, and we'll make this a number. The case tells us that there's going to be a drug interaction or a drug utilization review check to be done, so we'll need to worry about that. We call this DUR alarms. And we can say, well, look, this is a very simple variable. There either were some alarms to review or there aren't any. And maybe we like to add some DUR details here, and that becomes a string here. We are also told that the pharmacist might need to refer with the doctor. So at the very least, we might have a doctor phone number on here. And I'm going to move this one up a little bit to be, whoops, by the doctor's name there. So this is a very simple data model for this. Note that there's only one drug on here. The DUR alarms are fairly simple here. There's nothing extraordinary. Looking at the case, there's probably one thing that we might want to add here, although we can probably do without this, is a substitute drug. So the idea is that if the insurance company doesn't pay for it or the DUR raises an alarm, then we can substitute one drug with another. Why do I say we may not need this attribute? Well, we can just specify the substitute drug in the drug name and call it a day. But let's put this in as a somewhat advanced feature in our business data model. So those are basically the very basic attributes. Now notice that I don't have things like a pickup time or a requested pickup time on here. And that is because the way the case story is told, everything that happens before entering the prescription into the system is not done on the system. So the workflow system does not need to know about this. And one key thing that is done before the system knows about the prescription is, of course, the waiting until an hour before it's due. So in this very simple model, the system simply doesn't worry about that because it does not happen on the workflow system, and we don't need the attribute for that. So let me finish this here, and we should get a confirmation that this gets deployed. Now the next thing we want to do is define the organization. Let's get rid of the one that was in here, and let's add our pharmacy. And we're going to add two groups of employees. There's the technician, and we're going to add a group of pharmacist. and we're going to add 2 roles, technician role, and we're going to add the pharmacist role. And we're going to add 2 users or 2 process performers here. We're going to say John. We'll give John a password, John Doe, and John is the technician. And we're going to add another user, Jane. Jane is the pharmacist. We'll give Jane a proper name here, Jane Doe. Even though they're both Does, they're not related. Now, we'll need to deploy the organization. This organization, we use Jane as the default username here. Actually, let's use John as the default username because John will be the one starting the process later on. And deploy this organization. Okay, next we need to worry about the BPMN model. So I'm going to create a new diagram here. And the first thing I'm going to do is rename the pool and give this the name fill prescription. And we know that the pool needs to have 2 swim lanes. The first one is called, let's call it the technician lane, and the second one is called the pharmacist lane. Now we need some actors. Let's get rid of the default employee actor that was in there, and we know that we need a technician and we need a pharmacist, and from the case description we know that it's the technician that will start this process or start cases of this process. Now let's look at individual lanes here. The actor for the technician lane is the technician, and the actor for the pharmacist lane is the pharmacist. Okay, so at this point I'm just going to hit save before it all goes boink. Description. And we're just going to model the process. Now, I said earlier that everything before the prescription is entered into the system does not really concern the system, does not really need the system, so those tasks do not show up. So the story is, patient walks up to the technician with a paper slip in hand. The technician says, "Thank you very much," puts the paper slip into a paper slip filing thing, and an hour before it's due, the technician takes the paper slip out, walks to the workflow system, and performs the first step, enter prescription into system. So this is when the workflow process starts. Now, the next thing that happens is the pharmacy system will perform a DUR check. Now, because we don't have an actual DUR checking system, the only thing that we can say here is that the technician performs the DUR check using some means, but reports the results back to the workflow system here. In an ideal world, if we had such a DUR system, we would make this possibly a service task and get the workflow system to talk directly to the DUR system. Don't have that here in our little assignment. Now, out of this DUR check, we have a decision to make. Either the DUR check raises alarms or it does not raise alarms. If it does raise alarms, it goes to the pharmacist to resolve DUR alarms. if it does not raise any alarms, the technician, by some means, whether it's looking things up in a file folder or looking at things in a spreadsheet or talking to insurance companies, determines the insurance coverage. However he or she does that, the results get reported back to the pharmacy system. And after that, there might be another decision to be made. If the insurance does not cover the whole amount, then the pharmacist might determine a substitute drug. And in either case, let's make this gateway here explicit. The next step is to pick and pack the prescription. Let's make this a bit bigger here. After the technician picks and packs the prescription, it goes back to the pharmacist for a double check. The prescription, and eventually the customer comes and picks up the prescription and pays for it, and this is a task that's being done by the technician again. Handle pickup and payment, and after that we are done. Now I'm just going to add another gateway in here so that we don't leave this task dangling. So this is our very simple version of the process. You can make this more complicated. You can ask yourself, for example, what if the DUR errors cannot be resolved? What if a substitute drug cannot be determined? What if the double checking of the prescription fails? All of those things can be added on in a more advanced version. But for now, we'll leave it at that. Now the next thing we want to worry about are some of these gateways here. For each gateway we can already determine a default flow. So we're going to go in there and say this is the default flow here. This one obviously does not need a default flow because it's a joining gateway. This one has a default flow here, and this one does not need a default flow because again it's a joining gateway. Okay, next thing we want to do is worry about the pool data, and this is going to be very simple. We're just going to add one business variable, and we're going to call this prescription, and it uses the business object that we defined earlier. There's no default value, we'll just leave it at that. Now we don't have a contract for the pool because nothing happens when we launch a case. Things start to happen only at the first activity here. So we're going to have a very simple instantiation form. And I said we're going to leave this simple and basic, so we're not even going to change the label on the button. We're just going to say this is the process instantiation form, and we're going to save it. So for extra bonus points, you can of course make this a little bit nicer. You can describe what is going to happen, you can change the label on the button, etc. But we're just going to go back to Bonita here and essentially do the same thing for all the other tasks. So enter prescription into system. We'll start building a contract. Needs the prescription, and in fact it creates a prescription object. So at this point we're going to say instantiate. And because this is the very basic version of our process, we are not going to do anything else here and simply say finish. We will let Bonita automatically do most of the work. We need a form, and again, in this very basic version of the process, we will not do anything to the form. Enter prescription form and save it. Now at this point, in a more advanced version, you might say, look, we don't need the substitute drug at this point. We don't need to know about DUR alarms, coverage percentage, or DUR details at this point. And that's all very well, and in a more advanced version, you can remove those, you can leave those out of the contract even. But as I said, we're going to do the very basic, the very minimum to get this into a working system. The operations here were automatically created for us. Okay, and on to the next task. So for the DUR check, we'll do the same thing. We'll create a contract. And again, very simply, we'll take the entire prescription business variable here. But in this case, we're going to edit this. And we're not going to do anything more to the details. We're just going to let Bonita automatically create everything. So again, operations are automatically created. And we'll create a form. And we're not going to do anything to this form at all. We're just going to give it a name. And because we'll keep it as simple as we can, we're going to be reusing this form. So we're going to label this very generically prescription form. And we're going to save this. And back to Bonita Studio. Now we're going to do the same thing for all the other following tasks. We're going to create a contract that edits the prescription variable, letting Bonita take care of the operations. And instead of creating a new form, we'll just reuse this prescription form. As I said, we're only going to do the very minimum necessary here. Now, in a more advanced version of this process, these different tasks might get different forms, should get different forms, because they require different information to work with. Not all tasks require all information in the prescription business variable. And you would want to customize these forms. And you would want to customize the contracts for these forms. But because we're only doing the very minimum necessary, we'll use the same contract and the same form right throughout the process. Save this, validate this, and we need to next worry about our two gateways to ensure that there are conditions specified on the flows that are not the default flows. So for gateway 1, we need to specify a condition for the flow to the task resolve DUR, and we'll do this by entering a little script. Now in this script we have, I'll make this a bit smaller, there. In this script we have all the variables available that we have in the pool. So we have the prescription available, and we know that in the prescription there was an attribute called DUR alarms. So we'll use that. And if DUR alarms is true, then we will go to resolve DUR task here. We'll give the script a name, check DUR alarms. And that's all there is to it. Same here for the insurance coverage. It's this flow that we need to attach a condition to. We'll do this with a little script. Again, we will look at the prescription variable, and we know that we had a coverage percentage attribute in there. And every time our coverage percentage is less than 100, we will look for substitute drugs. So let's save this. Let's check the validation status. The only thing that's left here is a warning about the overview page for cases, and we're not going to worry about that because that gets very complicated very quickly. So the next thing that we need to do is to examine the mapping of actors from the BPMN model into the organization that we have defined. So we'll configure the server here. We see that the technicians are not mapped yet. We'll map the technician actor to the technician group and also to the technician role here. And we'll do the same thing with the pharmacist, mapping the pharmacist actor to the pharmacist group and the pharmacist role. We can double check whether the authenticated user is properly set, and we'll say finish. And essentially this completes our process. We can now run this process. And this is our process instantiation form, the very basic form. We didn't do anything to it. There's just a submit button that lets us launch a case. The first task is to enter the prescription into the system, and we might fill in some of these values. Patient name is Jill, doctor name is Bob, doctor's phone number, prescription was issued today, drug name, something good, lots of it, 5 refills please. And at this point, as I said earlier, we don't normally need information about substitute drugs, coverage percentage, etc. But because we've kept it very basic, these form fields are presented to us. So let's submit this. And the next task is the DUR check. At this point, we pretend to be the pharmacy technician, having done a DUR in some other way, and maybe the DUR has raised some alarms. Something is wrong here. We tick the box, we fill in some details, and we submit this. And as you can see, there are no more tasks to be done for the pharmacist technician. We will log out and we will log in as the pharmacist now. Jane was the pharmacist, and Jane sees the task resolve DUR alarms here, and Jane takes this task and can enter other things. Substitute drug might be something not quite so good, and a little less of it. We might want to even clear the DUR alarms, although there's not much point because we don't use this later on in the case. Now, the pharmacist has nothing to do, and we're back to the pharmacist technician here. John now needs to determine the insurance coverage. John goes in, looks at this and says coverage percentage. The insurance only covers 50% of it, half of it of something not quite so good. Submits this, and again, there's nothing for John to be done because the process goes over to Jane, who now has to determine a substitute drug. And Jane might do this by calling the doctor, Bob, on the number 555, but eventually they might agree on a substitute drug that's something really not all that great, and instead of a little less, we get a lot less. So again, we can change the coverage percentage. Maybe the insurance covers now all of it, but again, this is not very important because we don't use this information later on in the process. And we'll submit this, and in this case the process goes on. So you've seen a very, very basic implementation of this pharmacy process is done in about 15 or 20 minutes here. And as I alluded to earlier, you can of course now make this a little fancier. Extra points, for example, for putting the timer in. So you could imagine that the technician puts the prescription into the system, and we will put a timer after that. So it might go right in here as an intermediate timer event. And the system at this point will wait until it's an hour before the due time. That also means you need to extend the business data model and actually have the requested pickup or the due time in there so that the timer works accordingly. Other things that you can do at this point are, as I said earlier, what happens if you can't resolve the DUR, what happens if you can't find substitute drugs, what happens if the double checking of the prescription shows an error. So you can react to all of those and have additional gateways that might loop back to, for example, redo the pick and pack, or to determine the substitute drug again, etc. Other things that you can do from this point going forward is to have specific and customized forms for each task. For example, the DUR check might just need a look at all the information in the prescription, but shouldn't be able to change it or change much of it. And instead, the technician at this point should only be allowed to tick the box about DUR alarms and maybe enter some details. So you can make this more realistic. There's a lot of customizability given in the forms. If we go back to the UI designer, you can pick any of these. Let's maybe pick the coverage percentage. The coverage percentage normally would be a number between 0 and 100, and you can certainly set limits here. You can set the minimum value to be 0 and the maximum value to be 100 here. You can look at any of these labels here, and you can edit these labels. You can make things read only. You can hide things entirely, or if you want, you can delete things. Just highlight this here and you can delete it. So a lot of customizability. I'm not going to save this. A lot of customizability in the forms to make this a more realistic process. Other things that you can do are is to extend perhaps the business data model and have a prescription have multiple drugs in it. That certainly happens. So in the business data model, you would define the drug name as multiple, and then you can have multiple drug names. The nice thing is Bonita will mostly auto-generate the appropriate forms and the appropriate contracts, and you have very little to do with this just by checking the multiple here. Okay, anyway, so a very basic process for this exercise.